T20 as an engagement group and of the discussion that we had during T20 Brazil as well. One of them, for instance, is the point on private climate finance. I think this is critical, and I think that there were some constraints this year because of the focus that was placed by the Brazilian presidency and by the organizing committee of T20 as well, which was composed by not only CEBRI, but two other think tanks that are governmental think tanks. There was a lot of emphasis on public finance, on MDB reform, which is a critical agenda, as both of you pointed out. But I do agree with Professor Bang that public finance should be catalytic and play a strategic role in the sense of de-risking other blended finance and private finance instruments. So it was very important. Brazil is the first country to be chairing G20 and then COP30 in consecutive years. This has been really very enriching, both for the Brazilian government, who I think has really been able to leverage the fact that they are hosting the discussions of G20 and bridging this discussion to COP30 next year. Ambassador André Corrêa do Lago and others with Task Force Clima played a very critical role in trying to bring together all of the discussions within the G20 that pertain to sustainability and climate action, and really channel these discussions into the strategic planning for COP30 next year. I believe that G20 Brazil has a series of important outcomes that pertain to COP30, both in terms of the agenda setting, but also in terms of the format and civil society engagement in general. So I represent a think tank that is 25 years old. It was one of the first think tanks in Brazil when this concept of a think tank was still very strange in Brazil. Throughout the past decade, we've seen the think tank ecosystem in the country really blossom. And I think this is one of the biggest outcomes of T20 in itself. There were more than 70 Brazilian think tanks engaged in the T20 process. We organized the task forces, so they were led by one Brazilian and one foreign think tank, which I think really facilitated this exchange. And only the fact of strengthening the network between all of these institutions is really a legacy for COP30, because especially the think tanks engaged, like Alex was, in Task Force 2, which was the task force focused on climate action and just energy transitions. They are in itself, Task Force 2 is in itself a network that can be leveraged to set the agenda for COP30 next year. I also think that G20, as a multilateral forum, has a fairly efficient and effective mechanism of civil society engagement through the engagement groups. More so than COP, I would say. I think COP needs a renewed framework for non-state actor engagement, and we can learn from the engagement groups within the G20 ecosystem. So this pertains as well to what Nicolau was saying, that is Minister Isabella's idea of organizing a T30 next year. So the engagement of civil society in COP, it's very often pulverized in the sense that a lot of organizations arrive here without working throughout the entire year on the agenda that they're going to be presenting here. And this happens somewhat. You can obviously criticize, and there's a lot to improve in the effectiveness of the G20 engagement groups, but it is a continuous work stream throughout 1 year. And I think that this kind of civil society engagement could be very interesting in the light of renewing the Marrakesh Partnership and renewing a framework for non-state actor engagement at COP. COP30 next year is going to be focused on implementation. Both Professor Amaf and Professor Bang said two interesting phrases that pertain to the gap between ideas and implementation, as Professor Dongbang put it. And Professor Ahmad also said, the solutions are staring us in the face. And I think this pertains as well to Dean Sonobe's point on climate fatigue. We are tired of listening to the same solutions. We know what the policy recommendations are, and very frankly, in terms of chairing T20, the policy recommendations were not innovative. We know what has to be done, but the think tanks really, I believe, play a critical role in detailing the implementation strategies to achieve these recommendations, and in critically assessing the trade-offs that are involved. The environmental agenda is full of beautiful phrases, right? The just transition, leave no one behind. There are lots of trade-offs associated to the hard decisions that have to be taken in these strategies. One example, in terms of the energy transition for fossil fuel dependent countries, how are we really going to equate this realistically? It's impossible to, we can redirect subsidies, we can do a lot, but we cannot imagine a new future without fossil fuels. And for countries that depend fiscally on this, it's like Brazil, this implies losing jobs, losing industries, stranded assets. All of this has to be quantified. Before coming back to CEBRI and living in Belém, I worked for a think tank, Brazilian think tank, called Institutu Escolhas, which means choices. And I think this is a very important name, because I think think tanks do play a critical role in pricing trade-offs that are at the table, and in bridging this gap between policy recommendations and policy implementations. We are all firm believers at this table on the role that think tanks can play in bridging, in forging consensus and bridging gaps between global north and south. But we also have to be very critical of our limitations, and we have to critically assess how can we improve our effectiveness, individually as think tanks and as think tank networks. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.